Hey everyone, Israel is currently in a war against the terror organization Hamas, and we know how hard it can be to keep up with all the news. So if you haven't had the time to stay on top of the latest developments out of Israel, we're here for you. I'm Ladarga Velazi, and this is ILTV's Weekly Review. A difficult and tragic day as the Israel Defense Forces announced the names of 10 fallen soldiers who died in Gaza, as intense fighting continues throughout the Strip and especially in the Rafa area. Following their deaths, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reiterated that there was no alternative other than to ensure the goals of the war and pledged to defeat Hamas. The IDF on Sunday cleared for publication the names of IDF soldiers who were killed in Gaza early Saturday morning in a serious incident in the southern Gaza Strip. 21-year-old Yakir Yaakov Levi, 21-year-old Eliyahu Moshe Zimbalist, 19-year-old Itai Amar, 21-year-old Stanislav Kostarev, 20-year-old Or Blumovitz, and 20-year-old Yeshaya Gruber, all from the Combat Engineering Corps' 601st Battalion. On Saturday night, the IDF announced that 23-year-old Captain Wassem Mahmoud had been killed as well.
בשעות הבוקר המוקדמות, עם השלמה של ההתקפה על החלק הצפון-מערבי של השכונה, כוחות חיל רגלים, שריון והנדסה מחטיבה 401 נכנסו בשיירות רכבי קרב משוריינים למרחב על מנת להתייצב בקווי המגע. לפי המידע שבידינו, בשלב זה, באחד הכלים ההנדסיים בשיירה אירע פיצוץ עז שנגרם ככל הנראה מאמצעי חבלה שהוטמן במרחב או כתוצאה מירי של טיל נגד טנקים. בתוך הכלי המשוריין היו 8 הלוחמים שנהרגו.
The incident is still being investigated by the IDF. In addition to these deaths, the Army announced the deaths of 2 soldiers killed in the northern Gaza Strip, 49-year-old Ilon Weiss and 28-year-old Eitan Koplovich, and another soldier, Yair Reutemann, who succumbed to his wounds sustained last week. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu mourned the soldiers' deaths, but pledged to continue the war until Israel's objectives were met.
על אף המחיר הכבד והמטלטל, עלינו לדבוק במטרות המלחמה. השמדת היכולות הצבאיות והשלטוניות של חמאס, השבת כל חטופינו, וידוא שעזה לא תהווה עוד איום על ישראל, והשבת תושבינו בבטחה לבתיהם, הן בצפון והן בדרום.
Meanwhile, intense fighting continued throughout the Strip, especially in the Rafah area. This as the IDF announced a tactical pause of military activity for humanitarian purposes that will take place daily from 8 a.m. until 7 p.m. until further notice, from the Kerem Shalom crossing to the Salah al-Adin road and further north. The IDF clarified that this would not impact its military operations in Rafah against Hamas.
Day 257 of the war in Gaza, the IDF infantry are deepening operations in Rafa and discovering dozens of terror tunnels. This as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken continues calls for a ceasefire and blames Hamas for the ongoing war. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz reports.
Secretary of State Blinken said the U.S. is still trying to bridge the gaps on Gaza ceasefire talks as Hamas continues to add new conditions to its approval to a proposed agreement.
Hamas has to make a decision. Is it actually looking out for the interests of Palestinian people? Is it looking out for its own interests at the expense of the interests of Palestinians who are suffering every single minute?
The top U.S. diplomat made clear that only Hamas was blocking a potential ceasefire.
Hamas came back with new conditions, new demands, including demands and conditions that actually went beyond what it had already previously accepted.
On the ground, the IDF offensive is continuing in Rafah. The infantry brigade of the 62nd Division is operating along the Egypt-Gaza border area and the key north-south Salah al-Din road. Givati is pushing deeper into Rafah, operating in neighborhoods where Hamas had built up its defenses and readying for an offensive in central Rafah. At the start of the operation, the IDF assessed that only 2,000 terror operatives remained in the city. An estimated 550 gunmen have been killed in Rafah, and the army said it has dismantled about half of the Hamas fighting force.
Tensions running high between the United States and Prime Minister Netanyahu after his speech in which he claimed that the U.S. was withholding weapons from Israel. In response to the speech, the White House canceled a scheduled meeting with Netanyahu on Iran, which was set for Thursday. Let's take a closer look at the full story.
On Wednesday, the U.S. administration expressed outrage at Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu over his speech in which he claimed that the U.S. was withholding weapons from Israel in a time of war.
I said it's inconceivable that in the past few months, the administration has been withholding weapons and ammunition to Israel. Israel, America's closest ally, fighting for its life, fighting against Iran and our other common enemies.
The Biden administration denied the allegations and expressed outrage at the comments, so much so they canceled a scheduled strategic dialogue on Iran with Israeli officials, which was scheduled for Thursday. In response to the video, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre stated that only one shipment of weapons had been paused since the start of the war, and that there has been no other interruption. Top U.S. diplomat Amos Hochstein was in Israel in an effort to de-escalate tensions with Lebanon, but delivered the message to Netanyahu personally that the U.S. administration was outraged and found his speech completely unacceptable. The relations between Israeli leaders and the U.S. administration are more strained than ever following the incident. However, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan does still plan to meet Israeli counterpart Tzachi Hanegbi on the current threats.
Well, as the IDF bravely forges ahead in Gaza, the northern front, as mentioned, is heating up. The Americans, in an attempt to avoid a full-scale war, are taking steps to de-escalate the conflict. But is the Islamic Republic-backed terror group Hezbollah even interested in de-escalation? Here to discuss the potential of diplomatic de-escalation is Israeli Special Envoy from the Foreign Ministry, Fleur Hassan Nahum. Fleur, thank you so much for joining us, as always. Let's start with this visit from Amos Hochstein. Do you see this as having any significant impact on the war in the north?
Well, Amos Hochstein has been trying for the last 7 months to de-escalate. You could say it's been successful. I mean, we haven't had a full-out war, but many people would say we're already at war with the north. When you have 60,000 evacuees not in their homes, for the first time in Israel's military history, a buffer zone within our country rather than in enemy territory, and with rockets killing people every single day, I think many could argue that we're already at war, and those diplomatic efforts have failed.
Now, Hezbollah has fired over 5,000 projectiles. As you mentioned, we kind of already are in a state of war. Tens of thousands of Israelis are refugees in their own country for 8 months and counting. Is there any kind of de-escalation that could, in theory, restore security for these Israelis who have been kicked out of their homes for months?
The only thing we could really do is ensure that the buffer zone is on their territory and not on our territory. So it used to be, after the last war, behind the Litani River. That was supposed to be a ceasefire agreement. A lot of people talk about ceasefire agreements. Another ceasefire agreement with a hostile enemy that has been broken. They have UN forces there that were completely useless, and Hezbollah crept towards our border to the point that now the 10-kilometer buffer zone is within our country, and that's what's causing all the evacuees. And so we need to get back to the point of making the north habitable, livable. Otherwise, for Israel, this is a real strategic loss and a big threat.
Now, on the northern front, there's been a major increase in these hostilities, but international bodies who are supposed to keep Hezbollah in line have not really done anything, speaking primarily, of course, about UNIFIL here. Why aren't we seeing more international pressure on Hezbollah, given it was Hezbollah who began these hostilities?
Well, this is the story of our lives, right, Emily? That we have the pressure being put on the country fighting for liberty and freedom, the only country that is a democracy with a rule of law, the only country that basically just defends itself and doesn't start aggressive wars. We see it in Hamas. We see how the pressure, instead of being on Qatar and on the Islamic Republic, the enablers of Hamas and Hezbollah, you see that the pressure is on Israel. It's the world turned upside down. And what all that does is empower and embolden the terrorists.
Now, we are almost out of time, but I just wanted to get your take really quickly on this daytime humanitarian pause in Gaza. Some officials have criticized this as Hamas has taken some of that aid that's gone through. Others say it's much needed for helping the Palestinian people. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I believe that we always have to act within international law and do what we need to do, because that's what makes the difference. We are people who believe in law, we have morals, we have ethics, and if this is going to help innocent people get food that their own leadership is preventing them from getting, then we should do it. Secondly, the whole world has different standards for us. That you can call anti-Semitism, and you can call whatever you want. And because there are different standards, then we have to act in higher standards. And that is the story of Israel. And so we will do what we need to do to keep the international law, to facilitate that humanitarian aid, and to be above our very brutal and barbaric enemies that put their own civilians in harm's way.
Well put. Well, as always, thank you so much for your time, Fleur.
Thanks, Emily.
And moving on, Israeli protesters were arrested on Monday night after they attempted to break through police barricades surrounding Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Jerusalem residence. The situation got out of hand after some Israelis took to the streets to condemn the government's policies. ILTV's Mayan Hoffman has the story.
At least one person was wounded and 9 arrested late Monday, Israel police said, after they clashed with anti-government protesters near Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Jerusalem home. Protesters calling for new elections rallied in the streets of Jerusalem in the afternoon, convening outside the country's parliament before marching toward Netanyahu's private apartment in the city. Many waved Israeli flags. Others carried signs criticizing Netanyahu's handling of pivotal issues, like promoting a divisive military draft bill that exempts ultra-Orthodox Jews from otherwise mandatory service, as well as his handling of the war with Hamas in Gaza and fighting with Lebanon's Hezbollah. The wartime unity government collapsed last week when Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot resigned. This left Netanyahu reliant on ultra-Orthodox and far-right partners whose hardline policies had already deeply divided Israeli society even before Hamas's attack on October 7th ignited the war in Gaza. In response to Gantz's departure, opposition groups have launched a week of street protests, which include blocking highways and organizing mass demonstrations.
The healing process of the Israeli country will start here. It started last week when Benny Gantz and Eisenkot left the coalition. We are continuing this process, and hopefully this government will resign soon. As if it won't resign, Israel will not survive.
I hope that the Israeli people will come in hundreds of thousands to say enough to the Israeli government, to Netanyahu, and hopefully this is the day that we will start the change from the destruction that Netanyahu made to a revolution, and then to revive the Israeli society and the Israeli people.
Eventually, when the protesters reached Netanyahu's house, some of them broke off and tried to break through barriers set up by the police, who pushed them back. At one point, a bonfire was lit in the street. Police were forced to use a water cannon to disperse the demonstration, which resulted in the arrests.
Battle plans have been approved for an increasingly likely offensive in Lebanon. That's the word from top Army brass, who say that the Army is ready and awaiting orders. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
Top Israeli generals have approved battle plans for a Lebanon offensive. According to the Army, commanders' orders were given for the acceleration and readiness of the forces for a ground operation to potentially push Hezbollah beyond the Litani River. The head of the IDF's Northern Command, Major General Ori Gordon, and officers approved the Lebanon battle plans following a recent intensification of cross-border fighting with Hezbollah. In a statement, the IDF said the generals held an assessment and operational plans for an offensive in Lebanon were okayed. The announcement came amid repeated and ongoing attacks by Hezbollah and allied Palestinian terror groups in Lebanon on northern Israel. Israeli leaders have warned repeatedly it can no longer tolerate Hezbollah's presence along its border, and has warned that should a diplomatic solution not be reached, it will turn to military action to push Hezbollah northward. Israeli air defenses shot down a suspected drone over the sea just off the coast of Gesher Haziv in northern Israel, close to Lebanon. The IDF also said that fighter jets struck Hezbollah targets in South Lebanon, including infrastructure and other terror targets. Hezbollah earlier released footage from what it said was one of its reconnaissance drones flying over northern Israel, including the Haifa port. It was unclear when the roughly 10 minutes of footage was taken, and the IDF has yet to comment. Foreign Minister Israel Katz warned, "We are very close to the moment when we will decide to change the rules of the game against Hezbollah and Lebanon. In a total war, Hezbollah will be destroyed and Lebanon will be hit hard." U.S. Envoy Amos Hochstein called for an urgent de-escalation of cross-border exchanges. The conflict, he said, between Israel and Hezbollah has gone on for long enough. It's in everyone's interest to resolve it quickly and diplomatically. That is both achievable and it is urgent.
As there was a sharp rise in anti-Semitism in many U.S. universities since October 7th, a newly released report exposes Yale University's hidden ties to Qatari money. ILTV's Rachel Safdie has the full report.
A newly released report by the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy has exposed Yale University's failure to disclose millions in Qatari funding in violation of federal law. This report is part of the Follow the Money project, which has been exposing the funding of U.S. universities by foreign entities since 2012. Volume 1 of the report, which was released in 2023, unveiled the persistence of non-disclosure practices at several universities, including Yale, which prompted federal investigations in 2019. The new report release shows that from 2012 to 2023, Yale University reported receiving only around $280,000 from Qatar, while the actual amount is estimated to be at least close to $16 million. Universities are required to report all gifts from foreign sources that exceed $150,000, and this substantial underreporting raises concerns about the transparency of these universities. The report provides more evidence to prove Qatar's strategy in financing more American academic institutions as part of an effort to have greater influence and promote the interests of the Qatari regime. ISJAP Executive Director Dr. Charles Asher Small said, "Despite prior investigations and warnings, Yale and other universities continue to engage in practices that violate federal law. The persistent non-disclosure of substantial foreign funds, as well as contracts and agreements with foreign foundations and government agencies, not only undermines transparency and accountability, but also possess significant risk to the integrity of higher education." As demonstrated in ISJAP's previous research, anti-Semitic incidents are more prevalent on campuses receiving Qatari funding compared to universities that do not receive Qatari funds. Therefore, there is concern that the same is happening at Yale, which has seen a sharp rise in anti-Semitism on.
Israel's security cabinet is taking action to push back against unilateral Palestinian statehood through a series of policies. This move comes as Ireland, Spain, Slovenia, and Norway recognized the state of Palestine in the aftermath of the October 7th massacre and subsequent war in Gaza. Similarly, conversations continue with Saudi Arabia over a potential normalization agreement. Thus far, the Saudis have insisted on a Palestinian state as part of an agreement. Among the policies which the government intends to promote in response is strengthening settlements in the West Bank, as well as a series of punitive actions against the Palestinian Authority following its campaign against Israel in the international arena. Prime Minister Netanyahu instructed the cabinet to bring all the proposals to a vote at the next cabinet meeting, but specifics of the policies to be implemented were not immediately released. Any moves against Palestinian statehood are likely to increase tensions with the international community and the United States, which has promoted two states heavily and is attempting to facilitate a Saudi-Israel normalization agreement.
The notoriously anti-Israel foreign minister of Norway has announced that his country would top up its support for UNRA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees. He said in a press conference that there is simply no alternative today nor in the foreseeable future to the work of UNRWA. Entirely, of course, disregarding UNRWA's systematic complicity in the October 7th massacre. Well, to the Norwegian foreign minister, here are a few facts about UNRWA that you should know. Number one, UNRWA employees participated in the October 7th massacre. This is a fact. 12 UNRWA employees were identified as actively taking part in the massacre. UNRWA teachers held Israeli hostages captive in their own apartments. The foreign minister says these are just a few bad apples in an otherwise reputable organization. But the truth is that UNRWA complicity with the Hamas terrorist group goes far beyond October 7th. Intelligence estimates that 10% of UNRWA staff have direct ties to Hamas. And as the IDF conducts operations in Gaza, it has found numerous UNRWA badges on Hamas terrorists. UNRWA humanitarian aid worker by day and Hamas terrorist by night. It has found that Hamas used UNRWA facilities to launch terror attacks against Israelis. It has found hidden tunnel shafts in UNRWA buildings leading to underground terror tunnels, even directly beneath UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza. UNRWA even provided them with electricity. These are not just a few bad apples. This is systemic collaboration with Hamas in Gaza. And this is not new information. Norway's foreign minister is choosing to ignore and downplay these glaring and obvious facts. Number two, over half of UNRWA's budget, 58%, is spent on education, with some 500,000 students learning in UNRWA schools. That statistic is from UNRWA itself. But what exactly is UNRWA teaching in its schools? Well, international report after international report for years have found that UNRWA textbooks contain anti-Semitism, legitimize and even incite to violence, and outright deny Israel's very existence. Teaching young Palestinian children that one day Israel will be destroyed and they can go live in Tel Aviv. And UNRWA teachers, well, a new report this year from UN Watch, the UN watchdog, found that 3,000 UNRWA teachers and staff in a Telegram group cheered and celebrated the October 7th massacre. They shared photos of the atrocities committed by Hamas and cheered on the terrorists, praying for their success. These are UNRWA's teachers. Teachers in Israel teach peace and coexistence. It's mandatory in every school curriculum in Israel. Foreign Minister, would you want these UNRWA teachers teaching your children, teaching Norway's children? And last but not least, fact number 3, there is an alternative to UNRWA. It's called the UN Refugee Agency, or the UNHCR, which is responsible for all of the world's refugees. They're responsible for around 20 million refugees today. But only the Palestinians have their own special agency, UNRWA. And UNRWA somehow categorizes descendants of those born in the British Mandate of Palestine, even if they're citizens of another country, as a refugee, completely inconsistent with how other refugees in the world are classified. So if you were born in the United States to a father born in the British Mandate and displaced by the 1948 war, and you have full American citizenship, you are still considered a Palestinian refugee. So that even multimillionaire American supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid are considered Palestinian refugees eligible for UNRWA services. And even Palestinians living in Gaza today, in their so-called homeland, are also considered refugees. This ensures that UNRWA gets to add more refugees under its mandate every year, essentially cementing Palestinians as eternal refugees. So, Foreign Minister, why should Palestinians have their own refugee agency with special extra benefits? Are they considered above the other refugees by Norway? So there you have it. And every country resuming funding to UNRWA is essentially funding Hamas and is entirely complicit in its terrorism against Israel. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at iltv.tv or download the ILTV Plus app. That's it for ILTV's weekly review. Stay safe and see you next week.